So, hello guys. We are back for yet another space on the current war in Ukraine. Today's space will mostly regard the paradoxical situation in which both sides are finding themselves right now. The paradox is that despite the claims from both sides, there is a advancement on the Russian side. We already exposed this last time by comparing the advance the first month of 2024, especially with the hope that post Avdiivka there would be a rush towards Ocheretino and so forth. That never really materialized despite the breach at Ocheretino. And then at the same time, the Ukrainians have this feeling that they do control the destiny. We would have a look at that further down the road, based to the fact that the shadow counter that they made up to this time, in their view, was mostly to stall the Russians, finish their defensive lines, and then expect the Russians behind those lines, and of course with the usual array of weapons. So basically, first of all, the drone line, Baba Yagas, FPVs, suicide drones, and then the second line, which is the plotted type of defense they're making. This has always been hit and miss on their part. We know about Ocheretino last year. That happened more or less around this time, when it was supposed to be a very hard position to take, and the Russians literally waltzed in due to the fact that the preparations for the defensive line were botched, according to the Ukrainians, or simply the Russians just took it by guts and managed to seize the positions around the 22nd of April 2024. And thereon, we had the May bait in Kharkov that could have been something bigger, but obviously the Russians never went as far as trying to threaten the rear of the Kupiansk area. And, well, as we already said, the first roughly 3 to 4 months in 2024, the Russians barely scratched 250 square kilometers seized on Ukrainian ground, and by now we are already over 800. So all that logic, and this is 800 based on, once again, deep state. If we have to be more thorough, we would see that the last 3.5 months, we are more or less at 1,000 square kilometers, plus you need to add the almost 500 square kilometers in Kursk, and the extra specs at the Sumy Oblast border. There we are between 60 and 80 square kilometers, but in any case, it doesn't really matter. Right now, we are back to this wishy-washy and to this garbage ground advantage. There are, however, some very weird things going on, because we were mostly expecting to see the lost count of Ukrainian forces drop like a brick, actually, post-Kursk. So roughly around the 25th of March, the logic was these guys are going to stop whatever they're doing on North Ukraine, southern Russia, of course, and they would start focusing more on the Donbass, given that they had multiple holes in the Donbass. I already explained this, that the biggest problem is that Toretsk counteroffensive didn't work, so we had all this yappy, all this bragging from Ukrainians, but at the end, it only managed to just stall the Russians in Toretsk itself, and then suddenly they make a breakout, and then they advanced on the eastern flank, and then advanced on the western flank, and on the western flank around Kalinove, and Chukabalka. Actually, the Russians are pushing beyond the high ground that leads towards Romanivka into the highway that goes south to north, so from Avdiivka to Konstantinovka. That area was one of those so-called garbage areas, which are mostly there to prepare for an assault of a larger scale. That garbage area in Pokrovsk was supposed to be Moskovske, Mirobulvivka, and then Malinovka, Nova Poltavka, and so forth. So right now, on that area, if you go and check deep state, there is, for instance, around the Nova Poltavka, Malinivka area, there was an advance with the Russians reaching Yelizavetka and then also going through. Of course, deep state hasn't annotated it. This is the usual thing that happens with deep state. We've spoken about this since they got threatened by the SBU. With regards to consequences, mobilization, whatever, doesn't really matter. Deep state is in deep denial. I unfortunately was forced to make a satirical series with them. So Peter State, please. It's absolutely unfathomable because we are reaching 300 square kilometers that are not on the map. Just because, for some reason, they are not allowed to publish them. If you want some very egregious cases, Biorivka, it's still green. We've seen the Russians actually go to the limit green area. We've seen the Russians also cut through between Verkhokanske and Grigorivka. As usual, we are speaking about people who do not care about the truth. We have already spoken about this. So roughly right now, Cope State is keeping at least 20 to 25 square kilometers in Vilogorivka. They are also keeping about 5 square kilometers on the other bank of the Donetsk. So yeah, it's as usual in this area. Then we have huge problems. Once again, deep state knows how to use the gray zone to just hide the losses. So around Yampolivka is partially controlled, allegedly, but actually the Russian lines are literally beyond even the current gray zone. Once again, we can add like another 10 square kilometers. In the Kupiansk area, they keep some salients on the area Zahrizove, Lozova, and so forth. The salient from Novakukivka is completely gone. The Ukrainians are way beyond that, so the green zone there too should not include roughly 5 square kilometers, I think, 10 even actually when you do it. So once again, we can keep going like this. I can show you areas when they are just delaying the advances, and it's like absolutely logical. I can understand that you cannot start showing the truth, given that deep state is a outlet which is regarded by the open public in Ukraine, but also on our side, as some kind of a tool of reference. Once again, it's a tool of reference just to see what they're going to admit they lost. And everything else doesn't actually really matter because, like for Oryx, every single outlet that is pro-Ukrainian and is allegedly doing a accountancy of one or the other, be that losses, be that territorial gains or losses, be that technical references and so on, you should just use it as a trend reference. So basically, how is it going? How much they're declaring losing and stuff like that. This, of course, is something that I do with Oryx. I do not use Oryx anymore for the losses, given what we found, given also if you check other open sources, so you don't need to trust us at Timor Criminal for the numbers. You can go, for instance, for aircraft losses during the Ukrainian war. You go to Wikipedia. The guys who are maintaining that page are absolutely fantastic because it's extremely well sourced. So you cannot deny it. And on top of it, they're using the same kind of sourcing as Oryx is using for their own loss statement. So basically, when Oryx grabs a plane that has crashed in Siberia and adds it to the losses of the SMO, well, you should do this just the same for the Ukrainian side. But somehow there are roughly 57 aircraft that are not on Oryx list, despite the fact that they are well sourced by the guys at the Wikipedia losses page. This is only one of the problems. The other problem is if you go now to Oryx, for instance, and go and check for Abrams, they have only one Abrams abandoned and captured. I know it's hilarious because we've seen at least 6 of them getting captured, but it doesn't actually matter. This is just to point out why Oryx is just to be used for what it can give you, not for what it is. Oryx pretends to be very tight on the counts and sources on. They're not. They are, when they are forced to declare losses, you know that they're doing the dump. And this is what happened multiple times when the Ukrainians were getting beaten. And it was temporary, so basically 1 or 2 weeks, you were literally seeing Ukrainians getting ground alive. Oryx would so that the update on the losses would not be as bad. We had this especially at the end of Kursk. Of course, Jakub could say that he was in vacay until the 20th, but when the 20th hit, you could see that he was expecting for at least one more Russian attack. You can also see how they updated. Russian losses from the same day are going to be on Oryx. Ukrainian losses from the same day, they are going to get checked to be sure that it's not a double count. All small tactics to avoid in some way replicating the truth, and it's extremely, I mean, it's not problematic because we know that they're not going to tell the truth about the losses. It's now a public policy in Ukraine to lie about what they lose. We've already had Zelensky getting caught lying, obviously saying, 45,000 killed in action and 370 something wounded in action. And we're like, my man, like, we have over 65,000 names at tea time, and then a month after, those 65,000 were 72,000. And then we had the missing in action, which was a very good technique that Ukrainians have found to deny the killed in action and also to deny the families payment. And this is the biggest problem that we're having right now when it comes to Ukraine, is that you cannot absolutely trust whatever they're publishing. The only thing you can trust is what you can see with your 2 own eyes. So when you see a tank getting blown, it's blown. You shouldn't start, trying to contest that. You should check if it's fresh, because a lot of times Ukrainian sources now have started to republish stuff, and you notice that pretty well because sometimes the weather doesn't match, the background doesn't match. You get specific details that show that it's an old loss. For instance, we've had recently a LHT-90M getting blown, tried to be passed as a new loss. Unfortunately, he was missing the prototypical cope cage, which made everybody think. Of course, then it was geolocated, found, and we found that the footage was at least 1 year old. But that's how you start seeing patterns. Of course, we've had also L posts on the Ukrainian side. So, for instance, they would absolutely start posting nonsense about how stuff was destroyed. But at the same time, the so-called distraction would show at best a damaged equipment, or in sometimes like the attack on a triple position of Koksan, not even any kind of damage. Once again, this is just a introductory note on what we're facing right now and why in some ways it's extremely weird to see the Ukrainians start to become more optimistic about their chances, despite the fact that, as I said, once you start doing the math, based on their own sources, the Russians are gaining 3 times more ground compared to last year. Of course, what they're saying is that, oh, but they're gaining 1/3 of the ground they were gaining during November and December 2024. But that's exactly what the peak is. But don't forget that meanwhile, the Russians have recovered Kursk, so that balance evens itself out. Now, the problem that we're seeing with Ukrainians right now is also a very problematic form of denial. And as I said, this denial is a tactical one in this case. So we spoke about the garbage ground that the Russians were going to start to cover. That has completely restarted now. So, for instance, if you guys saw today, the Russians pressed yesterday towards Mala Tokmashna. They were coming from Novoprokopovka, and probably they have already seized part of Biro Horia that is north of Novoprokopovka. The problem with this logic is that it would mean that the green positions showed by deep state on the area are actually not manned, because the Russians just cut through them. And we had this for a second time. The first time was the crazy push of over 7 kilometers from Toretsk towards Sherbinivka and then Leonidivka. But the second one, because unfortunately Ukraine has this absolutely shit show of a nomenclature for its cities, that you have 3 or 4 similarly named hamlets on the same part. So basically, they broke through Toretsk, they took the eastern highway on the other side of the Krivitoretsk, and they just crossed until more or less Ivanopilia. And there they were stopped. At least one of the vehicles was shown blown up. No infantry whatsoever along the highway stretch. And it's completely normal, because normally if you start looking a bit, the infantry would be on the stretch between Kleban Buk and Pleshivka, so on the other bank. Completely logical that this part, so the gap between Pleshivka and Alexander Sheltine, is completely empty, or at least is defended at a distance by FPVs and other nasty shit. On the other side, nobody was expecting the advance on Kalinovo and the approach to Stara Mikolaivka, which would completely level the line from Tarasivka to Leonidivka. And this is something I already explained over 2 months ago. Right now, what the Russians want is to fix the Ukrainians on a line beyond the Krivits river, Krivitoretsk river, and basically from there on just work it out in the middle of the field, because up to more or less Pleshivka, the topographic map advantages the Russians. However, once you go to the reservoir west of Pleshivka, then you have a obvious defensive position when it comes to the Russian side. But also you can start installing that artillery that right now is not being allowed to. They are still firing from Shumi and Pivdeni. Once you start installing that artillery in Toretsk and you have a good enough buffer of at least 7 kilometers to the reservoir, then, as I said, you can start treating. And I already posted the tweet from actually February, but in the 1st of March of this year, I laid out the whole foundation of it. So once you are gone to Pleshivka and going through with the situation, then what the Russians seem to be doing is to start grinding this trash ground around Pokrovsk, around Konstantinovka, and preparing the Ukrainians for a dilemma once again. And once again, like last year, we get the second dilemma. Last year, we had the dilemma of defending Ocheretino and leaving Southern Donetsk, so the area around Ugledar, which has been an absolute shit show for the Ukrainians. Like, let's remember that in around September 2024, the Russians were 45, 46 kilometers from where they are now in distance. And the biggest gain, actually, of the late 2024 was around Ugledar. And it was exactly what the Ukrainians were scared of, which is once they go beyond Ugledar, they would go and get Velika Novosilka, make a contact line. I explained that you start raising the Ugledar wall. And now your line, which during the counter was over 180 kilometers in length, linear kilometers, but about 160 kilometers in straight line. Now the wall is established in a certain sense. And so if you are defending from Rivnopil to basically the Dnipro basin in Energodar, you have only 110 kilometers. So the line of defense that was more or less straight from the Dnipro basin to Ugledar was 150 kilometers, but then because Krakow wasn't taken and the Russians were still at Marinka, it was 175 kilometers. So we are roughly where we said we were going to be. So right now the Russians on that line have erected this wall at about 105, 110 kilometers, have shaved a huge 60 plus kilometers of continuous defensive line on the Ukrainian side. And they have completely erased whatever gains, numerically speaking, were done during the Kursk Oblast incursion. But because of the Kursk Oblast incursion and in infamy, the whole point of Kursk now is obvious. And initially, it was maybe some kind of bargaining chip or whatever. But within 2 to 3 months, given how the Russians were pushing beyond their lines in the Pokrovsk area, also in southern Donetsk, I think the Ukrainians were being here forces the Russians to have a completely detached area to actually fight and expel us out of the territory. And the main stalling, because of Kursk, happened into the synchron operation that was supposed to approach, in my opinion, the line from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka. And initially, the cut through that was supposed to isolate one city to the other, which is now obvious, given that the Russians have physical presence in the highway between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka. Now the Ukrainians are forced probably going to go through Dobropila, and they had enough time to do it. And this is the biggest problem that we spoke 3 to 4 months ago, which was go as fast as you can in order for the Ukrainians not to start creeping to Kursk, because then you have all kinds of byproducts of that. And one of the byproducts is what you're seeing now, that the Russians, having suffered in Kursk, trying to dislodge the suicidal bunch that was there, lost, in my opinion, 2 to 3 months operationally, where they could have gone beyond Sherbinivka, Toretsk, and reached Romanivka by now. However, fast forward, we are now 3 months after the fateful decision from the Ukrainian side to start a double push in Kursk in January and then in February. which both ended up in tears and just made the situation worse for them. Now, that has apparently also cost the Ukrainians space control and enough troops to man the line from, as I said, Tarasivka to Leonidivka in the axis Alexandropol Toretsk. But since the 7th of April 2025, the Russians have started an operation in order to correct this situation. And for now, about roughly 8 days, it's going pretty good. In 8 days, they seized roughly about 60 square kilometers, and they've pushed the Ukrainians back roughly around Stara Mikolaivka and in between Romanivka and Sukabalka. This means that if the things go the way they should, now the Russians have a 6-kilometer line from where they are at their most advanced point to Leonidivka, which normally, given how we saw the advance on the Russian side, should be under Russian control, despite the fact that it was liberated by Azov. As we've seen, anything that Azov has quote-unquote liberated so far has been retaken. And this by geolocations, not by me. Therefore, what we're seeing is some more garbage space north of Sukabalka, and from there on you have only downslopes. So if Sukabalka falls completely and the Russians keep going towards the Kryvyi turrets up to Romanivka, then the lower ground from Leonidivka to Petrivka, Shebinka and Klebanvik is gone. The Ukrainians would have at least 2 thrusts of Russian forces going at them on both sides of the same body of land. I probably think that the Russians are going to cross on both sides. So basically, they're going to go through Romanivka and then through Petrivka, and then we're going to receive the same situation that was had for a while into the southern Toretsk area. And then to the Ugledar area. So basically, when we had these very patchy, completely hollowed out area of control, and then the Russians did another push, and then they got towards Velika Novosilka, and then you had this, what was taken, what was not. First Staromerska was taken, Makarivka was taken, and then Velika Novosilka was thought as a huge problem to control, but suddenly it broke, and then you had the unification from Rivnopil to Rozdolny. Now, the problem with this plan, as I said, is that if we have to analyze it properly, they are about late, 2 to 3 months late. And this is the tenacity of the Ukrainians to stay in Kursk, and then they started again going at Belgorod and Demidovka, which was the second part of the plan for Kursk. In August, it failed because, well, Ukrainians. But then they started to do the same thing in order to force the Russians to still stay a little bit in the Sumy Oblast area, which, once again, in my opinion, was stupid. But, you know, the Ukrainians, as I said, are unfortunately one-trick ponies. And, I mean, you can see it in everything they're doing right now. And it doesn't matter if it works or not. For instance, they keep going at it with FPVs, but they do not see the equalization that happened on the other side. And I know that there are a fuck ton of articles allegedly talking about how the Ukrainians are still on top, especially Philologist in ambush, which describes a situation that is hilariously bad, especially when he says that optifiber FPVs come from humanitarian help. Just so you know, guys, optifiber FPVs are so far at 99.9% issued from the Russian Ministry of Defense. So Minoborn has specific groups that has started to train with it and then started to roll them out slowly. And a couple of groups have their own FPVs. For instance, Rubicon works with the Acorn type FPV that we saw initially, then it was slightly changed, and you can see that by the serial numbers that are very specific on, sometimes they are shown on the lower right corner of the screen when you see a optifiber FPV working. Then we have Sudo, which has been using both their own, you can recognize it by the red UI, and a different approach into how the FPVs are also designed. So the Vandal optifibers, the first iteration was a square frame with a tandem placement of first the warhead, then the spool for the FPV, whereas the homemade, home-cooked pseudo-Platov FPV follows more a up, over, under model, which is under you're going to have the spool canted in a certain angle not to break the fiber. The idiots at Madhyar do just the same. And then over it, you have the warhead or the payload, whatever they put on it, canted on the other side in order then to be able to have a contact detonation. On both sides, there is not only impact fuse, but there is an electrical fuse. So when you hear the nonsense that some guys like Philogin Ambush and stuff like that are talking yet again about this stuff, it's extremely of bad taste. So in my opinion, either he's allowed to say that in order to stuff the pro-Ukraine audience, but once you start seeing the losses, you cannot just believe that. And once again, you go to Oryx, and right now the losses are 1,201 since the beginning of the year for the Ukrainian side, and 1,489 for the Russian side. That's 1.23 per 1. It's extremely low of a ratio for the Ukrainian side. This is an absolute apocalypse. This is something that we were waiting for in early 2024, given the passivity of the Russian forces from roughly May 2023 to October 2023, and then of course it changed because the Russians started their offensive to Avdiivka, and then the losses started mounting. But we were going to that kind of losses back then, but not that bad. I had surmised that 1.8, 1.9 would have been fine, as to really grind the Ukrainians down. But now we are at a practical 1-1. Of course, it's not 1-1. There are areas, for instance, in Kursk, you know that the Ukrainians lost more. Other areas where the losses are too close to call, in the sense that for Ukrainians, as I said, the human losses need to be very high in the ratio, so at least 4-1. They're never 4-1, and at the same time, the equipment losses that were generally more positive for them now are going into a complete different way. So initially, you can justify by the fact that the Kursk area had finally boiled down to what it was, which was a giant trap for the Ukrainian forces tasked with maintaining the salient. But now that the Kursk area is gone, and we're still having losses thanks to the optifiber assets, and those optifiber assets now are being used, as I said before, not only as an offensive tool or a defensive tool, but they are literally now offering the Russians something that they missed for a long while, which is a sensor fusion in NATO speak, and the capability for the Russian forces to see and hit at the same time. The optifibers are not detectable at most of the times. Now we have seen more and more radar CUS, so basically a passive radar that is supposed to detect movement, not frequencies. Before because of the radio frequency emissions from the drones and from the pilot, you could use a spectrum analyzer or other tools to detect the presence of those drones. But because now you have a wired contact between the operator and the drone, there are no emissions. The only emissions that you're going to have, unfortunately for you, is the heat emissions when you get hit on your ass. But the drones are still flying, even if they're very slow. The Russians are more and more using them at a peak of 100 kilometers, whereas usually the FPVs would fly between 120 and 150 maximum. And this is for maneuverability, and also because they can use most of the time electrical fuses, which allow them not to care about the momentum of the FPV, which would help with the impact on the vehicle if it's a simple impact fuse. So what happens right now for the Russians, now they've understood that it's a kind of stealthy killer, but also allows them to see in 4K, I'm exaggerating of course, but to see clearly what they're targeting. You don't have this grainy view from before. You also are not forced to use DJIs or Zalas. They can be their own scouts if you have more or less an idea, due to, as I said, SAR, any kind of radiation emission, or a satellite picture, or a drone seeing something. So for instance, if you can see in the distance a artillery barrel firing, you're going to understand that, okay, that's the general direction. Send the fucking drone. And because also the spools from the get-go were extremely long, so don't forget, if you look into bullshit, said that now it was very dangerous because the Ukrainians have FPVs that fly 20 kilometers without a problem. Well, as I said, this is where not only there is nothing new, but 20 kilometers was achieved by Ukrainians already last year with radio frequencies on wireless, because the Russian electronic warfare was extremely patchy on the front line. However, since, as I said, 8-9 months now, the Russians have spools of 15 and 20 kilometers for their optifiber FPVs, which make it almost impossible for any kind of barrel artillery, given the way they're used in this war, to actually evade getting attacked. The only thing you can do is just lay sea wire or a net or whatever, and hope that it would entangle the FPV, or that the other side will not have enough FPVs to attack your artillery asset. So, as I said, once you start looking at the losses, even on Oryx, because once you start looking at the real losses, not those that Oryx is giving up, you have to understand that Ukrainians are, for the moment, maybe they're going to receive an influx of something else, a bit fucked. Because, for instance, in Kupiansk, we've seen them pull out non-cope cage T-72s. We've seen T-72Ms with a modicum of cope cage. We've seen M113s without cope cage or any kind of standoff protection at all. The more we advance, the more we're seeing that Ukrainians are pulling whatever they can right now in order to stabilize or try and stabilize the situation. And logic, of course, for a long while was explained by Ukrainian turbo pushers as actually Ukrainians trying to finish fortifications beyond a certain line, while basically hurling shit at the Russians, hoping that it would stick. Now, as I said, the biggest issue with that is that on the Ukrainian side, a lot of issues haven't been solved. First of all, the UNPK situation is still the same. Within 2 2 or 3 weeks, we first had fighter Boomer complaining that the UMPKs were nowhere as precise, which was, of course, a huge fat bullshit, but that's how mostly this kind of black PR the Russians are doing works. But now we have seen, thanks to TT-125, which had the first video on them, and now we have also a second video, a picture of it. The Russians have gone and made another Cometa board, so basically electronic warfare protection asset, which is bigger and also has a very special packaging at it. But basically, fighter Boomer comes back now and says, oh, okay, it's fine. They are precise enough, they're hitting it back again. This is a kind of a small bullshit, because what might have happened is that those Cometa boards are now being applied to Shahids. Because one of the biggest things that has changed when it comes to impact and basically target acquisition has been that for now a month, Shahids are hitting. Remember the funny stencils from the aerial defense of the Ukrainian side? Well, we don't see that anymore. We don't have these super duper nice images of Vampire intercepting Shahids. They sold at some point a tactical interceptor of their own making, so basically another FPV drone going over 300 an hour that would intercept the Shahids when they were ferrying towards the target. That thing isn't going anywhere, not because it's not useful or efficient, simply because now the Russians have more Shahids to throw, are hitting far more. It's normal, like that's how, ratios work. If you have more of them and even, like they get intercepted at the same ratio as before, well, more will pass. That's the logic. But right now we have them flying at every single time. We recently also discovered that the Shahids have a new electro-optical payload. So basically, what was awaited from the Shahid already by 2023 is finally a reality since this year. Although we had seen images of that already by last year, end of the year. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Just to say that the Russians are adding tools that were already a problem for Ukrainians. So as I said, UMPKs, they are now, again, quote-unquote, unjammable. The same system is used on the Shahids, and the Ukrainians still do not have an answer to that. The only answer they have is counter-force, which is, you hit us, we're going to hit you. And then most importantly, the Ukrainians cannot go into any kind of offensive right now, because despite the fact that they have a regenerated aviation force through some Mirages of F-16s, the rules of the game haven't changed. So basically, part of that fleet needs to stay on the back in Western Ukraine, Central Ukraine, to intercept long-range drones and cruise missiles. But the other part that actually targets Russian positions, mostly on the front line, has a big problem not getting shot down. One was lost recently. It was hit by S-400, F-16, of course. But what they're doing right now is trying to get away with coming as close as possible and releasing either GBU-62s or GBU-39, so between 100 and 250 kilograms of bombs, most of them along the front line or slightly on the rear of the Russian forces. However, those strikes right now have had a lot less impact, and the same is actually also true for the Russians, because both sides have now started to atomize their groupings, lower the smallest fighting units. So initially we started with companies. As I said, then companies became the backbone of assault and defense. Now we're down to platoons, and in sometimes, as you can see from the capture of defensive points on both sides, we are down to chokes or half chokes. So the biggest issue that both sides are having right now by trying to avoid taking mass casualties, they also are reducing the efficiency of their tactical groupings. This, of course, affects you less when you're on the defense because, if you have a FPV, artillery, or whatever support, 6 guys can man a trench against 10 or 12 because it's mostly a matter of information and the execution based on the direct intelligence. So a guy who's telling you, oh, the guy is right next to you, pop out and kill him, of course, that allows you, knowing that information, to be right on the ball. Now, on the other side, if your support fumbles, then even 2 of their guys can just empty your trench. So right now, the equilibrium remains on the quality of information that both sides have on the offense or in defense, and also the kind of opposition that you have both on offense and defense. For instance, it's very problematic for the Russians to start assaulting a position when those guys have barrel artillery or MLRS on attack. On the other side, if the position is isolated, even if the assaulting teams are taking some losses, they're going to get the position. So it's not simply a intelligence issue, it's also a availability issue on tools and possibility to operate that intelligence and enact with the means of defense or offense you have at your disposal. And this is how we are going to get to something else. So how does it work that the Russians are getting more ground while by every single account right now we are hearing that the Russians have less means, less armored vehicles, less everything actually. Russia is going home. I mean, come on guys. No more missiles, no more tanks, no more guns. Thank God there is North Korea. So what's going on? Well, what's going on is that the Russians have decided to go back to what they did in 2023 initially. You remember 2023 started pretty poorly with an attempt at Ugledar, and then they started another push in Zaporozhye. The push in Zaporozhye was mostly, in my opinion, to ensure that they would have the best positions possible to defend themselves from the upcoming counter. But the push in Ugledar was, again, an attempt to raise that Ugledar wall in order to shorten the space to defend. Basically what they did in 2024. Both failed, more or less. Zaporozhye was a bit better, but Ugledar, you know what happened. I'm not going to go back at it. Then Ukrainians go to their own counteroffensive. They get absolutely butt-fucked. And we end up with a situation when the Ukrainians have lost a lot of their armored assets, and they did a thread on that. They started to send foot mobiles. We all remember the Verbove 80 ditch, or light vehicles. And you could see by the degradation of the military transport how the counter was going to shit. And that's what happened. The moment that you saw first 1 Bradley instead of 3, then only MRAPs, then only IMVs, and then only pickups, and then you had these guys trying to infiltrate on foot, you knew it was over. With the Russians, however, it doesn't work like that. With the Russians, the more the pretense is that they have nothing, the more actually they gain ground. As I said, we are roughly 1,000 square kilometers taken, although, as I said, thanks to deep state, we're only seeing about 800. But it's good enough, whereas last year, with armored assault, they were at 250 square kilometers. So you'd say, what's going on? Well, as I said, the biggest issue that the Russians are facing right now are three things. First of all is a multi-pronged assault that they have started, and you can see because it's Kupiansk is still ongoing. They have crossed the Oskil River. Then you have the Zherebets push. Then you have the Toretsk push that's still ongoing. They have also tried to go through the flat on the reservoir beyond Klishivka. Then you still have them pushing into Siversk area, so they took Bilogorod. Then they pushed towards Verkhokamyansk and Grigorievka. Then I said Toretsk. Then now we have another push, which is still in Chasov Yar, but is pushing through the garbage ground between, as I said, Alexandropil and Leonidivka. So slowly, all these areas are the first problem. Before the Russians would try to synchronize all these different assaults in armored vehicles, but due to the ecosystem threat, FPVs, remote mining, HIMARS, artillery, whatever, the losses would be extremely high, even if all what was possible to be done in terms of electronic warfare was attempted. We remember everyone, the huge Mad Max electronic warfare device that was put on a T-72B3M in the Ternia area. That stuff stopped 19 drones until basically one hit and cut the transmission. Tank was abandoned, and the generator kept going for at least 1 hour. The drones just couldn't hit it. When the generator basically was out of fuel, then the fuckers at Azov approached the tank so that actually it wasn't terminally destroyed and just lifted it. So this anecdote shows to you that it doesn't actually really matter what you're going to put there. The only way not to get stuck in a way or another is to go fast enough and get close enough to the other side so they would have to just abandon the field of battle. Anything else, even if you approach up to 500 meters, but you get hit by a remote mined area and your track is off, well, thanks for playing, it's gone. And so the choice, in a certain sense, has been made that we would reserve the armored pushes when we have the best chance to do so. And that's how we saw that, for instance, the 7 kilometers of rush towards north of Toretsk, or now the push towards Tokmashna, or other pushes in Kupiansk. Those are the ones that should be armored. For everything else, we've seen them using ATVs, bikes, whatever. The whole point is speed. The problem with that thought process is also that it tries to hide something else. So as I said, much has been made of the inability to sustain mechanized forests into Ukrainian lines. However, the light motorization of these attempts tries to point out something else. First of all, these guys believe that they can breach through whatever gaps is there. And on the second time, you can also say, oh, see, we have this schematic that shows that the Russians are losing less equipment, but it doesn't mean that they are saving anything. They're just losing that equipment because they don't have anything anymore. And it's logical. You can see that, especially between December and March, the tanks, especially tank losses, are extremely light. However, now we have in April, and now suddenly we have another hike into losses. And guess why? Because now the Russians have understood that the phase when they could basically farm the Ukrainians in select fronts, like basically the counterattacks around Pokrovsk and the Kupiansk and Kursk area, are gone. The Ukrainians have gotten their ass kicked over there. What they're going to do right now, they're going to let the Russians come. And it is to their advantage. So, the Russians, as usual, they are cynical. So what they're going to say, it's pretty simple. A motorized push, even by fucking Ladas, going fast enough, is going to bridge that gap. The whole idea of the motorbikes, the whole idea of the ATVs, how the Ukrainians used it in their ambush-style campaign in 2022, it was exactly this. And there is a logic behind it. You can just go straight, Occam's razor, they're using light vehicles because they do not have heavy vehicles. And I'd say, you know what? Yeah, you're right. But if they're using light vehicles, they're gaining 3 times the ground they were gaining last year while they were attacking with all these huge vehicles. Then there is something there that maybe is not that bad. Because there is a paradoxical issue with this makeshift motorization. The first issue is that the motorization doesn't seem to yield more casualties than armor. Yeah, of course, you have a durability problem. So basically, when your buggy or your Lada hits a TM62, you're going to lose half of the crew. Everybody's going to get hit. But if you don't hit that one and drop your guys, then what? On top of it, as I already explained, once you're going to lose your armored vehicle, let's say M113, M2 Bradley, and you cannot move around it, you have only 2 choices. Seclude yourself into your panic box, or get out and get FPV'd, arted, or simply even killed by bullets. And there is what I told you. The motorization doesn't seem to yield more casualties in absolute. And this is made worse in the sense that the quantity of drones that both sides are using is to be compared to the quantity of and quality of armored assets. So as I said, Ukrainians are going to throw 100 drones to 10 armored vehicles. Far more conspicuous. Huge problem when they get hit because sometimes they survive, but once they do not survive, all that you get is a fucking armored coffin. We've already been there. And the only downturn right now in this kind of environment, as I said, is just the durability of your asset. However, that is rebounded by something else. These assets that seem less durable, they gain more ground. It's a statistical. We can explain it by other stuff. I mean, there hasn't to be a causality link between using a Lada and gaining 300 kilometers. But where this is very, very, very interesting is that the tempo that you need to sustain with heavy armor, so basically available units versus available and willing infantry, is negative. Once you lose your 20 or so BMPs, you're going to wait for 20 others. The logistics of that is far more heavy than grabbing 20 pickups. Once again, it's very cynical. It's even stupid. But if it works, it's not stupid. It is, however, borderline criminal. But people are taking those risks. And I said, the problem with the armor is that it doesn't protect you the way you think. If you can withdraw, it's all fine and good. But the deeper you go with your armor, the less chances you have to withdraw. You're going to get either captured, so basically permanent loss, or killed, permanent loss, or you're going to limp back wounded and hopefully make it. Temporary loss. As I said, one of the reasons why this thing is working is that you have enough infantry, and what you need is assets to move them fast across the field. It's, once again, very cynical. But it is the reality of this war right now. So, the tempo of operation in this logic is greatly helped by those street cans, those buhankas and everything. And as I said, it matches perfectly the early trend of Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian forces initially started to lose a lot of heavy armor, heavy assets, and they, as you may remember, with this wonderful skit when you could see a team of Ukrainian mortarmen driving a stolen or donated DHL van, and then a German journalist pointed out, said, what the fuck is that? That was the armored or not armored vehicle that we're using. And we had this for the whole year 2022. It didn't seem to make any kind of big wave on the western side. It was completely normal that, deprived of armored assets, the smartest thing in terms of concealment, in terms of retaining mobility and everything, was to ride civilian. Well, what is good for the goose is good for the gander. So, as I said, this allows the Russians to retain mobility and retain tempo of operations despite the loss of equipment in the early phase of operations. Sometimes you have a flexibility and quality, unfortunately, that exceeds that one of demothballing a BMP. It is what it is. We can accept it or not. It doesn't actually matter. But a good second-hand pickup is going to be easier to maintain than a BMP. And it's also going to be easier to replace. Of course, replacing the guys that wire on it, it's awful. But it is how it is. So, that's how we're going to, laughing at the Russians going with the Lada and crying that the Russians with the Lada just kicked your ass and took 60, 70 square kilometers on one of your worst axes that you absolutely don't need to lose. And of course, it doesn't happen by magic. You got a work on the background, UMPKs, FPVs, recon, all that shit. We go back to, they are on Ladas. Why are you losing so much ground then? Why are you losing so much people? Why are you fucking getting 900 guys back every month? Of course, it happened only once. Before that was 700. And before that, 500. But you get my point. And then, finally, the motorization positive byproduct is going to peak in the coming months because we have the blooming season upon us. April, May, June, you're going to have natural concealment. Leaves, trees, tall grass, all that shit. Not every area, of course. For instance, around the Liman forest, part of the forest has completely been calcified. So, but you get my point. On top of it, the issue with the soft ground up until mid-April, early May will disappear. So light motorization is there to stay for as long as the calculus works for the Russian side. So as I said, if you use 10 BMPs and 200 guys and you get 10 destroyed BMPs and 100 killed guys and 0 results, but on the other side you use 15 pickups, 200 guys, you get 10 pickups destroyed and you just gain 150 kilometers while also retaining 100 guys, how do you think it's going to work? At some point, unfortunately, as Joseph Stalin said, becomes a statistic. And this is the cynicism that I spoke since the very first day, even before actually the war started. I was then addressing how the Russians were likely to take out the Bayraktar threat just based on them flying and shooting them down every single sortie. And that's exactly what happened. The difference is that they didn't wait to get wasted by them to start shooting them out pretty fast. You can go to Oryx and see the homage to the Bayraktar kills, and right now the Bureks have killed less than the Orions for 4 times the losses. And that's it. So once again, I'm going to repeat, trying to see everything through the lens of this is shameful, this is no. Unfortunately, this war, but generally wars work like that. You got an optimum that you may or may not achieve, and then you got results. There is a price to pay, and unfortunately, the price in the current ecosystem of threats is going to be extremely high each and every time. And on top of it, given the composition of who is helping the Ukrainians stay in the war, if by some magic the Russians suddenly nullify every advantage that Ukrainians have, then we probably will have a backlash from the Europeans, even though it makes it worse. And that's it. That's the whole point here. The whole point since the beginning has been that this war is supposed just to drag and bleed Russia. But the moment when the Russians started to advance again and, well, reduce everything to ashes, we had all these small steps of escalations, all these so-called layers that would breach those Russian red lines. And here we are, 3 years and 3 months after, 2 months after, we are looking at Russians being on the move, maybe not as fast as themselves would say. Monkey admitted that by saying like some people would like us to go faster. But within the objectives that now we're seeing, and the Russians have repeated those to the Americans now multiple times, which is 4 oblasts, Crimea, small army, no NATO, whatever about the EU. Probably there would be other issues to solve, but those are going to be mostly technical. But the core of the request has been, once again, 4 oblasts, Crimea, no NATO, small army, whatever EU. And we're heading to basically agreeing with this or letting it play the way it's going. And the way it's going even if we have to stop about 4,000 to 5,000 square kilometers from now, the way that where the Russians are trying to go right now makes it simply useless for the Ukrainians to try and pass this for some kind of victory. There are areas where, unfortunately, without as I said, a decision, a military political decision, is not going to work. So, Kherson beyond the Dnieper, extremely complicated. It will only work if the Russians are besieging Zaporozhye and are obviously already in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. And that's it. There is nothing more. You cannot just, pretend to do things and no. Right now, politically getting full Kherson, full Zaporozhye is a suicide for Zelensky. Military getting them would mostly work in exchange for land grabbed in Dnipropetrovsk or in Kharkov. For Kharkov, I do not believe it that much because, it would require a very specific task group of forces, and Kharkov, unfortunately, is a huge city, it's the second city of Ukraine, and therefore trying to take it, the only way, in my opinion, which has been since the beginning, would be to literally cleanse that city. So all the stuff that are dropping all over the front, the 150 to 100 AU MPKs, would be forced to be concentrated on Kharkov. Reduce that city to rubble, make it uninhabitable, and then just move through. But what are you gaining once you got Kharkov in that state? I mean, leveling Bahmut, who the fuck cares? Leveling Uledar, whatever. Leveling Avdiivka, not really happened, but still. Ocheretino was fastly gone, but in any case, small hamlet. But starting to completely raise a oblast capital, but also the second city of Ukraine, there is no logic into that. So I think Kharkov will not be touched unless we get the same kind of nonsense we had with Kursk, and then the Russians are going to go full on pressure. Now, the other issue is that despite things that have been said, we haven't heard the Russians say we will not go for Kiev. This is not hopium. I'm not saying they're going to do it. I'm just saying it has never been said. So I also understand why Zelensky, in a certain sense, is not ready to have that discussion. Because what is going to stop Russia from doing it up north? And the best thing with how the borders are is if once Russia gets Zaporozhye, as I said, gets enough bridges to cross on the other side and starts threatening Kryvyi Rog right off the bat from both sides, plus Nikolaev from both sides. So it's going to be a no-go anyway. Therefore, there will be no peace unless there is a major Ukrainian defeat, and that major Ukrainian defeat is going to be held by guys on ladas, guys on donkeys, North Koreans, and of course the usual Russian gambit, which is force Ukrainians to have a dilemma on which area they want to defend. And if they're too stupid and split them up, then hallelujah. Because, as I already said, Pokrovsk is a completely different beast than Konstantinovka. But Konstantinovka, once it falls, it opens the door to Drushkovka, Slavyansk, and Kramatorsk. So suddenly, defending Pokrovsk if you're losing Konstantinovka makes no sense. Because the whole point of Pokrovsk was to cut the supply lines, the straight supply lines to Konstantinovka. If you cut Konstantinovka and start to threaten the sister cities up north, then Pokrovsk makes a lot less sense to defend the way it's being defended right now. The only thing it's going to give you is more headaches and more attrition, negative attrition, of course. And we can see that in some things that are starting to pop up. Starting to pop up in the left flank of Konstantinovka. We've seen a couple of tanks getting laid up there. We've seen a couple of artillery assets. Those are supposed to protect Konstantinovka from the breakout from Chasiv. What they are doing, however, is that they are forcing the Ukrainians to have two sets of defensive tools. One of those is being aimed towards defending from Chasiv, so they're around Stinky, Molocharka, Novodimitrovka. And the other set that we're seeing lost is around Ilinivka, Ivanopila, and Berestov. And of course, Pleshivka, because we saw the Russians rush towards there. However, that logic, so basically the Russians forcing Ukrainians to have a two set of defensive assets over 12 kilometers of range, is forcing the Ukrainians to open up more, you know? If you can defend within Konstantinovka, then it's fine. But if you are forced to have all this huge kind of distribution system within that city's defensive system, but you got already the Russians that have rushed to Pleshivka. Once again, guys, you cannot imagine how close that shit is. It's literally 6 kilometers from the southern entrance of the city. It's just madness. But by having the Russians do all this nonsense there, the Ukrainians think that they are actually winning. They think they are just attracting the Russians to a certain point. But with the ongoing of time, if the losses that we're seeing on the Ukrainian side keep going like this, we will get to a certain point where we already were previously, which was that the Ukrainians were facing a downward trend in 2024, which was ramped up by the offensive in Kharkov Oblast. You remember that they panicked and they started to ask for using Western weapons in Russia proper, which they got, by the way. The Ukrainians are going to feel the same kind of panic now, but the difference as compared to 2024 is that their main sponsor, militarily speaking, the US, is not having it anymore. And they will have to rely on European assets. Thank God, Europeans right now do not have any available replacement for American assets like the HIMARS or the Atacams. The only way that Europeans can help is the Taurus and more Scud, but it's a completely different beast. And also the ammunition that the Ukrainians are getting so far hasn't changed. So we hear a lot of bullshit about, Rheinmetall going into a better place, having more equipment and ammunition to send, and everybody in Europe is doing something to accelerate the production and the delivery of these to Ukraine. The problem with that, once again, is what is being delivered, and we had already discussion in Kursk, is not, in my opinion, an supply line issue or a ammunition issue. We've seen Ukrainians getting killed or captured, and they had ammo to stay there for weeks. The 2 or 3 777 Lotto bingos that were captured in Kursk, we saw their pits. They had probably beyond 400 rounds. So for that day, they had more than enough equipment and supplies to keep firing. What happened is just they got overrun or spooked into leaving their positions. And this is exactly where we're going back to the Ladas and donkeys and e-scooters, all that stuff. What the Russians need right now, it's not more equipment, it's not more armor, although it's necessary. I'm not saying that, but they need speed and quality of operation. So if in the following 2-3 weeks we see more of what we saw recently, so that push in northern Toretsk, the push that we saw in Tokmachna, if it goes like this, a bit what we had in September 2024, that's how the Ukrainians are going to start flipping again. So far, the Ukrainians had decided to sacrifice whatever asset they had. They wouldn't care. I mean, even by Oryx numbers, the losses right now for Ukrainian tanks are the highest they've been as Oryx has counted this war. Even for the first year, they are heading with the current losses on Oryx for over 430, 40 tanks a year, which would be the highest they've had so far. And that's it. You don't need to, bother yourself with it, because it's a snail-paced war, but that is now for the Ukrainians costing them extremely far more assets than it was in 2023 or 2024. And on both years, the Ukrainians could point at specific happenstances when they could say, okay, we did the counter, it failed, so we lost a lot of shit. 2024, we did Kursk, it cost us a lot of shit. But in 2025, Kursk was all but gone. You are supposed to be in better shape because you pulled up whoever wanted. You now are starting to get 18 to 24 under contract. 500 of them. Amazing. Like, theoretically, Ukraine right now should be into a solidified shape, and as Kavoli said, Ukraine is not destined to lose. And I'm like, yeah, you're right, they're destined to be partitioned if they keep going like this. But it's not that much of a problem as it stands right now. What it stands right now is, I said, we're into garbage time. A lot of the things that are going to get captured, overtaken, a lot of pushes that we're going to see for at least the rest of this month and next month are going to be areas where pro-Ukrainian goons are going to berate Russians with, oh, you lost 1,000 guys for a field in the asshole of Donbass. We heard that. You remember what happened once they started to lose huge peri-urban areas after Ocheretino? It was exactly this. And then they started to be on suicide watch because they lost rather large agglomerations in 2 or 3 days, given that they were not prepared to get hit into the mouth. And this is what's going to happen the more we're seeing the stuff we saw, that attempted push towards Konstantinovka, the attempted push in Tokmachna, the takeover in Mali Sherbaki, and Lobkove. All the small things are announcing areas where the Ukrainians cannot be at the same time. And if this thing goes exactly where it's supposed to go, I'm telling you, roughly end of May, then the Ukrainians will have to decide what they want to defend, Konstantinovka or Pokrovsk. And once they are into that dilemma, I do not have faith that Ukrainians will be able to do anything else but shit the bed. And I hope I'm wrong, but they will try some other folly in order to avoid making that choice. The same way that they avoided making a choice in Pokrovsk and instead went for Kursk, the same way they're going to avoid making that choice in Donetsk, be that in Pokrovsk or in Konstantinovka, and they are going to go for another adventure. And right now, they do not seem to have that capability beyond light armor. But there is always the problem of at least a roughly 80 pieces of armor that haven't been shown yet. So that you got the 49 M1 A1 Abrams from Australia that haven't been transferred as of yet, and then you have the 30 M84 A4 from Croatia that haven't been popping out anywhere. The help from the Czech Republic and from Poland, we've already seen a few of them getting offed. So that stock has already been put into action and probably has replaced the losses that Ukrainians have taken from August 2024 to roughly March 2025. And therefore, I am telling you once again, the nature of this high command, this Ukrainian high command, is to try and force a decision, even though it's a marathon. They will try to make it like it is a sprint. That's exactly what they did Kursk. That's exactly what they are trying again in Belgorod. That's exactly why they're choosing for flashy moves, even though they're going to lose in the long term. The point is to be able to show, quote unquote, that they can do it. What they can do, we still are waiting for that. Krinky was a disaster. Kursk is a disaster. The counter was a disaster. And these people mock the Russians for going and headbutting into Avdiivka. But the results of that headbutting are here today and are haunting them because they are in a worse situation than ever, despite the fact that they say they have stabilized Pokrovsk. There is no rollback. Russians are taking more ground every day, maybe not in Pokrovsk area per se, but that's the whole point. This is the whole logic of the garbage ground. While you're focused on Pokrovsk, they are going around you somewhere else. And this was the case for Gledar, Velika Novosilka, and all this shit. The problem with Ukrainians right now is that they need to figure out what they want from this war, quote unquote. Do they want to have something at the end of the war, something to say during negotiations, or do they want to end up with the Russians being at 10% to their final objective? So basically, they would have taken most of Donetsk Oblast, and it would remain just what they cannot seize right now militarily on the other side of Dnieper. And literally, having reached the borders of, as I said, the Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast and also Zaporozhye Oblast, and going beyond into Dnipropetrovsk, then I'd simply started to plan a completely and massively crazy adventure, but basically crossing and forcing the Dnieper. That, in my opinion, is right now not feasible for both armies, but it could change, as I said, if they start to besiege Zaporozhye city, if they advance until there, then Ukrainians would have to make a choice, which is deciding to lose Zaporozhye city, because as you know, the city, its eastern bank, is connected by 4 bridges in total, One is a rail bridge, two are new road bridges, and then a third one is kind of a passenger foot mobile bridge. So at that point, if the Russians are threatening Zaporozhye city, and given how the city is connected, it would be game over for the city on long term. It would be also abandoning crossing into the western bank, but there is not much to be done. That's why I'm saying choices will have to be made on both sides. And finally, one of the things that is surprising me is how everybody has completely forgotten about what was said, and I made a thread about that, about the counter in 2023. I didn't make the thread, actually. It's Jan Matev that made the hilarious thread in April 2023, but people have forgotten what was being said 2 years ago. If you want, one of the most profound changes that happened in this war, if you want to know where you are as of now, Ukrainians are bragging about not losing a couple of villages in Pokrovsk, where 2 years ago they were bragging about kicking the Russians out of Ukraine. That's it. That was the space. If you want to ask questions, if you want to contribute, it's up to you guys. But yeah. So guys, if you have nothing, it's not a problem. I don't mean this as some kind of reproach. Then it's over for the moment. By the way, for the next 3 to 4 days, I will be busy with personal issues, and I would probably post a lot less, but there will be no space. However, on Thursday, like today, so in 1 week, I'm doing a write-up on the operational art regarding the ongoing operation for southern Konstantinovka. And I'm going to point out a couple of things due to the losses there, so you may start to understand why the Konstantinovka axis is far more serious than what I initially thought. So basically, I treat it as garbage territory in order to force Ukrainians to do something stupid. But actually, they're going for it. And they're not going just, to threaten the Ukrainians. They are going for it because it makes sense right now. And in my opinion, this has to do with them having, once again, insider information over the Ukrainian forces, their numbers, their deployment, and this once again is showing that the Russians might look gauche, might look a bit clumsy, but that stuff is working. And given what the SBU is claiming for now, about 3 months, it's clearly something has broken within the ranks of the Ukrainian army. As it stands, the SBU is going all crazy, trying to find moles and waiters and stuff like that. These guys do exist, by the way. Thank you very much. Have a nice day, guys, and see you in a week. Bye.